Let me ask you a question. What's your definition of a hot rod? I'm guessing that depending on your age, you might say something like a 32 Ford Highboy Roadster. Or if you're a little younger, maybe a 55 Chevy. Two-door post like the one on, what was it, two-lane blacktop, or other movies like that. Or maybe a 69 Camaro, or maybe something else. Well, for me, the definition of a hot rod got formed when I was about 12 years old. I was at the local drugstore and I was walking by the magazine rack and I saw this magazine. And remarkably enough, this little magazine, I would say, changed my life. First of all, it caught my attention because the term rod and custom, I'd sort of heard that term hot rod, and that got my attention. I saw this car, kind of an unusual car, and down here at the corner it says it was a Barris-built 41 Ford. Well, at age 12, which is about what I was at the time, I knew this didn't look like a 41 Ford. I knew what 41 Fords looked like, and this wasn't it. So the idea that you could take a 41 Ford and turn it into something that looked like this, that was pretty amazing. But what really got my attention was this little line right here where it says CAD-powered cars, coupes, roadsters, customs, pickups. Well, at the time, in 1957, Cadillac was a big name. I mean, that was the standard of the world at that point. And so the idea that a Cadillac engine could be put in something else, some other vehicle, was a remarkable thought to me. Now, you have to remember, in January of 1957, the small block Chevy was only a couple of years old and had not yet become the standard hot rod engine that it did become later on. So in 1956, when this magazine was actually put together, Cadillac engines were still kind of popular for hot rods because they were introduced, the overhead valve version was introduced in 1949, 331 cubic inches, so a fairly large engine for the day, and that overhead valve engine weighed 200 pounds less than the flathead Cadillac V8 engine that it replaced. So that's why some of these hot rodders back then decided that would be a great engine to stick in an early vehicle. So, for example, here was one of the cars featured that had the Cadillac engine. And once again, sure, a 32 Ford Roadster. Definition of a hot rod. So for me, this became the definition of a hot rod, to take a newer, bigger engine and put it in an older, lighter car. So let me ask you this. Do you think the vehicle I'm standing in front of right now, I'm going to show you in a minute, do you think it's a hot rod? So what do you think? Is there any way we could call this 1987 BMW 5 Series sedan a hot rod? Well, if we go back to that definition I just used earlier, that if it's got a newer, bigger engine in an older, lighter car, then yep, this is a hot rod. Because lurking under the hood here is a Chevrolet LS engine. It's actually an all-aluminum 5.3 liter with a bunch of modifications that it took to fit this into this car. Here's how this car came about, and how it played a key role in turning what had been just a little hobby, a hot rod hobby, into a hot rod business. And so if you got a minute, I'll share some of those details with you. Now, let me talk about the car first of all. I bought this in 1999 to be a daily driver because I'd taken a job that was about 50 miles away from where I lived, and so I had a 100-mile round trip commute every day, and I wanted something that was fun to drive, that was comfortable, that would get decent gas mileage, handled well, had good braking, those kinds of things. And I'd owned several BMWs before that and knew that they fit that criteria, because BMW in the 80s was way ahead of other car makers in having figured out how to make a car handle well, have a firm ride without being harsh. and having decent fuel economy and being fun to drive. The only problem with this car was it had an automatic transmission. I didn't want that, but the rest of the car was so good that I went ahead and bought it anyway. Well, I ran it from 60-some thousand miles up to over 200,000 miles, and finally the automatic transmission quit. So now I'm faced with the dilemma. Do I spend more than $3,000 for the only way that most BMW experts said would fix that transmission, which was to get a factory remanufactured version from your dealer? So over $3,000 was almost as much as the car was worth at the time. So I had a couple of friends that we'd been making some hot rod parts for big block Chevy engines. And they said, hey, Wayne, you know, you're a hot rodder and you're a BMW enthusiast. Maybe it's time to mash those two things together. So at the time, LS engines, this is in 2005, LS engines were still fairly new on the scene. They were starting to be popular to put in the typical things like first and second gen Camaros, Chevelles, C10 trucks, and that sort of thing. There was even a couple of companies that had sprung up to put LS engines in newer 3 Series BMWs, but obviously there was nobody putting them into older 5 Series BMWs. So I thought, well, this is going to be sort of a challenge because I've never done a fuel-injected engine swap before. Now, based on that 1957 issue of Rod and Custom magazine, that prompted me to say, I want to do that. I want to do an engine swap someday. And so finally, when I was in my 20s, I had a chance to build my first street rod, which was a 1934 Plymouth with a 318 Dodge engine. And so from then on, putting newer, bigger engines in older, lighter cars is something that I really enjoyed doing. But I had never done a fuel-injected engine. So I figured, well, it's time to figure that out. And also then to see what it would take to put that engine into this car. Because this originally, of course, had an inline 6-cylinder engine, and that meant that there were some tight spots in the engine bay. So let me share with you where some of those tight spots were. So when I went looking for an LS engine to put into this BMW, the Corvette and Camaro engines were all aluminum, and so that was going to save weight, but they're also very expensive. So I thought, well, maybe because the truck engines with the cast iron block are so much less expensive, I'm going to have to sacrifice the weight. But one day when I went to the salvage yard, this engine was available from that particular yard. And in 2005, they didn't have a really good market for it because it came out of a 2005 GMC Envoy, which maybe you know as a Chevy Trailblazer. So the problem was, of course, it had a tall truck intake. It had a tall truck alternator position. So I knew that was going to have to be changed. I knew that we were going to get really tight over on this side of the engine because that's where the steering gearbox is for the BMW. The good news was this car came with Hydro Boost brakes. So it didn't have a big honking vacuum canister over on that corner to try to get around. So that solved that problem. Another issue was, since I'd never done a fuel-injected engine before, I was really intimidated by wiring harnesses and all that sort of thing. So I brought the whole engine wiring harness, fuse panel, and all of that over from the GMC Envoy, took out a few things that didn't need to be there, hooked some of that back to the factory fuse panel you see over there. This is actually a late model Camaro radiator that was about the right width and had the right hose sizes and so forth to match the engine. And then, of course, we figured out a way to squeeze in an air intake over here. And one of the problems that I was going to have with this engine also was the low mount factory AC compressor. And in all the research I was doing on forums, other guys that were doing Camaros and Chevelles and C10 trucks were having that same issue, and nobody had just a simple AC bracket at the time. Billet Specialties and March Performance and people like that had a whole complete serpentine system, but nobody just had a simple AC bracket. So we thought, well, maybe we could figure out a way to do that. And that, as far as we know, was the first just simple AC compressor bracket only that anybody had come up with at that point. Now, one of the things I will point out that made this engine fit was we put an LS2 Corvette intake manifold because it had the right 4-bolt pattern for this drive-by-wire throttle body. We put a GTO oil pan on it because it's a front sump, which matched the BMW compared to Corvettes and Camaros that were rear sump. We also used early Camaro exhaust manifolds, which were made out of a stamped steel, a kind of a stainless steel. We knew we could go in and weld and modify to make it clear the steering gearbox. And then I was faced with, how are we going to do this drive-by-wire throttle body? Because there's this big honking foot pedal there was just no way I could find any spot to put that under the dash. So I'm walking by the engine bay one day, carrying this foot pedal, trying to figure out what I'm going to do with it. And I happen to notice, well, we already have the original BMW drive-by cable, throttle cable sticking out here. What if we just took that foot pedal, eliminated part of the foot area itself, and mounted the foot pedal over here on the inner fender and connect it back to this cable. So now we actually have a combination drive-by cable, drive-by-wire kind of throttle body. So one of the issues I found on forums like ls1tech.com, and there was even a BMW forum talking about engine swaps, guys trying to use the LS engines, the factory AC compressor runs into frame rails or cross members or something. And so I had that same issue, and I got together with my two buddies that we'd been making some big block conversion plates to put serpentine systems on early big block engines. And so we thought maybe we could figure out a way to mount an aftermarket AC compressor up in this general location, which could certainly help with this particular engine swap, but it looked like maybe that would be a solution for all those guys doing the more conventional Camaros and Chevelles and so forth. So we developed a plate and tube sort of design, and this vehicle then became the test mule to make sure that that was going to work properly. And it worked well enough that we actually, by that time, had incorporated. We'd put up a website, and we introduced our first AC compressor bracket in 2008. And then after that, this vehicle continued to be a test mule for us, testing various compressors and brackets. And what you see here is the latest version where we've taken the Sandon mini compressor, the little SD7B10, and mounted it in a wide mount configuration. This could work with the Corvette balancer, which is now on this engine, rather than the truck balancer that came with it, and would also work with LS1 Camaro and then truck and 2010 and later Camaro balancers as well. We did make one custom bracket for this particular application, and that's this alternator power steering bracket, because obviously the truck alternator sat up here and wasn't going to clear the hood, so it needed to be moved out here. We chose this location because that's about where the factory Corvette alternator sits. But then we also made a custom bracket so we could reuse the BMW power steering pump. Partly because at the time I didn't know enough about power steering pumps and GM pressures and flows and that sort of thing, and I didn't want to upset the power steering feeling, and also because it was a hydro boost, I didn't want to upset the braking, so I wanted to carry over that BMW power steering pump. I did discover that there was a later model that had a serpentine pulley because the one that came on the original engine was a V-belt. So we made this custom bracket, but then we discovered that people, when they wanted the bracket for that side, sometimes wanted to relocate things over here. So we then developed a bracket that used the GM power steering pump and looks very similar to this. So those are some of the things that we discovered along the way, where this was a custom version, but later we came up with a production version. Sometimes hot rodding can be all kinds of fun. So for example, when I was trying to figure out how to wire this fuel-injected engine for the first time, and finally got it to the point where I turned the key on the test stand and the engine came to life, Well, if you're a hot rodder, you know how much fun that can be. The first time you hear an engine start up, especially when it's usually got open exhaust. But there was something special about the first time I could fire up a fuel-injected engine and actually make it work. So that was a big thrill. That was a big sense of accomplishment. One of the next things was almost the maiden voyage for this vehicle. Once I got the engine in, did a few test loops around locally, was I took it on the 2008 Power Tour for a few days. So to take an engine and a car that had not been combined before and actually take it out and get to show it off to other like-minded enthusiasts, that was also a big thrill. Now, this car has a lot of miles on it since the engine swap, because I was still using it as a daily driver, as a commuter vehicle, for about another 7 years or so after the initial swap was done. And then finally I retired from that job, and this then just became kind of a fun car to have. And so there were some things I got to do with it. We took it to the first Holly LS Fest. Actually, I think that was 2010, if I remember right. We decided to be an exhibitor. Our Kwik Performance company decided to be an exhibitor at that Holly LS Fest. So we had some foam engines with our brackets on it that we mounted in some big wooden boxes, and we lashed those to the back of a little flatbed trailer. And this vehicle towed that trailer to the LS Fest where we exhibited those engines. And got lots of enthusiasts to see what we were doing, and made some good progress there. Well, one of the things that also was fun about that was that because this was certainly the only 5 Series BMW that was at that first LS Fest, it caught the attention of Mike Finnegan, who at the time was a writer for Hot Rod Magazine. And so Finnegan did a little interview with me, and I'll show you here in a second, a simple little write-up where they covered a whole bunch of vehicles from that LS Fest, and the headline on the front of the Hot Rod Magazine was, the hottest, newest engine swap. And so we got a little coverage about this vehicle in that magazine. So here's I think it's the February issue of 2011, Hot Rod Magazine, America's Hottest Engine Swap, which is all about LS swaps. And over here on this side is the little article that Finnegan put together with a few details about the BMW, and a quote from me, and a photo of the car, and a photo of the engine bay. So that also was a big thrill. I think all hot rodders have this dream that someday maybe you'd get your car in Hot Rod Magazine. And so this is probably the closest I'll ever come to having any kind of feature in Hot Rod Magazine. So as I said, in addition to being a test mule, this car also got to take some fairly long trips. I mentioned the Holly LS Fest. It's been there a couple of times. Street Rod Nationals a few times at various locations for NSRA and Good Guys events. And then in 2014, I had the fortune to get to join the Driven Dirty Tour. Now, the Driven Dirty Tour was something started by a guy named Ken Finnickel, also known as Posies. He has a company that makes hot rod springs in Pennsylvania. And several years ago, he was going to be an exhibitor at the SEMA show in Las Vegas, and instead of trailering one of his cars to the show, he decided to drive. And he decided to invite a bunch of his hot rod buddies to drive along with him. And so instead of cleaning the car up once they got to Las Vegas and making it all shiny to go in the booth, they decided, let's put it in with all the road grime and show people that hot rods can be driven. And so he called it the Driven Dirty Tour. And so I think this was about maybe the 10th year or so. And so I joined the tour in Kansas City at Pete and Jake's hot rod shop, where the group was gathering, and joined them for the rest of the tour to Las Vegas. So this car has also been all the way to Las Vegas and back. So that was another one of those things where it was really fun to get to be a part of a group like that. And for this car, which normally wouldn't be thought of as a hot rod, but I got to join a bunch of other hot rodders and their hot rods to go on a long tour like that. And so that was lots of fun. So yes, I've done a few more conventional hot rods as well. I mentioned the 34 Plymouth and a 41 Chrysler and a 50 Chevy pickup. And you can see over here behind me is a 48 Chevy pickup that we're just finishing up with an LS engine. Narrowed Crown Vic front suspension and some little tricks like that. We recently finished up a 68 Chevelle with an LS swap. But this one has a special place in my heart because it's an unusual hot rod, and the role that it played in actually creating the company of Kwik Performance, that makes it really special.